Hey chaps, it's quite late in the night, almost 3 o'clock late. But sometimes you're in the mood to talk about aliens, so that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna talk about aliens, we're gonna talk about the movie Aliens, and we'll talk about life exploring the universe, and we'll end with a conversation around superior cybernetic mind's impressions and perception of its creator. The outline of the conversation is as follows. We start ourselves off with talking about aliens and with a quick review of the latest Alien movie, Alien Romulus. We then talk about the life depicted in Aliens and how realistic is it that that's a life in store for um, the people of 2300 and 2500 and the year 3000. And we'll talk about the human AI relationships, which tend to be a dominant theme in these movies, David, etc. Right, so let's start with aliens, right? One of the more fascinating topics for all sorts of reasons. Now, when we think of aliens, and when we think of ourselves, there's so many different dynamics possible, right? The dynamics that we mostly see on screen is where these aliens, they're hostile, they want to wipe us out, they want to harvest our resources, they want to harvest our organs, right? That's a dynamic. And that dynamic can play out in multiple ways. One is that there's a significant mismatch, right? Where either that alien species is very weak compared to us, but if that was the case, because we are very close to the start of our space faring journey, right? So if a civilization was able to reach us, I think you'd have to assume that it has enough firepower in its arsenal to be able to give us a real good fight, right? It might not be able to do things beyond that, but I think that'd be the base level assumption if they have been able to reach us, because we are nowhere close to like being able to do any of that sort, right? Like again, progress can be the progress curves can be different in the sense that their weapons could be substantially more powerful than ours, while their space um, firing capabilities might be on par with us, right? So always possible, but generally these kinds of technologies go hand in hand. Like you have to build this for you to be able to build the next thing, and then this next thing allows you to build X, thing Y, thing Z, and that's how it goes, right, with technology. So that's one dynamic. Another dynamic is obviously the flip dynamic, where the alien species is so much more powerful compared to us that we stand no chance, right? It could either happen that they just send one weapon of mass destruction, like a nuclear weapon, which is like a billion times more powerful than the Star Bomber, and that wipes our species out in a jiffy, right? We don't see that coming, or they just send an asteroid towards us. They just use their rovers to change the trajectory of some asteroid belt. They've been observing us from some base in Europa or Io or Titan, and they're like, okay, enough with the humans. Let's just get them. We're done with humans. Let's just kill them all, right? So that could be one dynamic. If that was the case, then this obviously would be the most terrifying, existentially terrifying thing to imagine, because there's simply nothing. Now there are obviously we've got a list of risk factors that humanity faces. For example, viruses, biologically engineered viruses. Then we've got obviously solar flares. We've got AI going rogue. We've got Earth crust displacement theory. I don't know how valid that is, but we've got all these different ways that could spell disaster for us, right? That could spell doom for us. Of all these different things, we can still fight them, we can still resist them, but if you imagine a species which is like, a billion years more advanced than us, if you just use a linear scale, then we are done, right? Imagine us fighting against ourselves, but ourselves of the year billion 2000, right? Like we just wouldn't stand any chance. Forget about billion, like a million 2000, or even like the year. Think about fighting against humans of the year 20,000 AD, right? Like we wouldn't stand any chance. And it could well be the case that there have been species living in the universe since probably 1 to 2 to 3 years after the Big Bang. So that very well could be the case. If such a species exists in the universe, there are loads of theories around this. But if such a species exists in this galaxy, then we don't have like we've not have long left, right? Again, the galaxy is a pretty spacious place, but a species that is like billions of times more advanced than us, like it would probably have solved faster than light travel. It probably would be conquering galaxy solar systems at the rate of millions per day, right? Or millions per um, whatever metric you want to use, right? So that would be the most terrifying thing you can imagine for humans, right? Like Yeah, demise would be quick though. And then you can imagine the dynamics where a species doesn't want us to flourish, like it sees us as a potential competition, but also doesn't want to wipe us off completely, right? And you can see these kinds of dynamics. You've seen these kinds of dynamics with humans, for example. A lot of our thinking around, our game theoretic dynamics with humans, with possible alien species, is obviously inspired by our own dynamics with our intra-species conflicts. For example, US has obviously uh, perceived a lot of other countries as threats, but the US has never wiped a country out. Well, it's obviously done a lot of harm, but it hasn't really wiped a country out because it just wouldn't go against all norms, etc. And also, morally, just wouldn't sit right with the US populace, right? So we don't do that. But we've actually seen that happening in the past where civilizations, cultures have been wiped out by a superior power, right? We've seen that with the Native Americans. They used to occupy, I think about this as a number, right? They used to be 100% of the occupants of North America before the year 1400, right? Now, 600 years in the future, which is not a long span of time, mind you, they're less than a percentage of the population, right? And if you look at the wealth, if you look at socioeconomic indicators, it's actually worse than 1%. So that is what can happen, right? So a similar dynamic could happen with humanity where an alien species might be like, okay, like they might be 100 years ahead of us, and they'll be like, okay, we don't want to wipe those people out because we're not that cruel, we're not that vicious, but we also don't want them to become a possible contender, possible competition in the future, right? So we'll cripple their wings right at this moment, because every moment that we don't cripple their wings, they're going to get stronger, right? And they might, same with Taiwan, right? You can see parallels between these kinds of dynamics and between the human dynamics. But that could be another dynamic. That'd be one of the more interesting dynamic. And then there's the dynamic where, so an example of this dynamic could be, I think in the movie Oblivion, the Tom Cruise movie, you obviously, I think either is an AI going that has gone rogue, or I think it's an alien that's sent this AI to humans, right? So you can almost think of it as an AI, as an alien. I think that is what happens. I don't remember the plot completely, but I think that is what happens in that movie, right? So that's an example of this. There's obviously the scenario where we're equally matched in terms of our technological progress, in terms of our weapons capabilities. An example of this is, I wouldn't really call this an example, but it's in the ballpark, right? And again, I mean that the equivalence would be complete. Like one species would obviously be better in certain areas, the other species might be worse. But mimics from the movie Edge of Tomorrow, which is one of my favorite movies. In that movie, the mimics have been on this planet for the last 5 years, and they've only captured the area of Europe, right? And obviously, like if you captured Europe, then China, Russia, Central Asia, all of that is fair game for you, right? But the fact that they hadn't done that in the movie tells you that there were some weaknesses that the movie glossed over. But that's an example of this kind of a dynamic, right? Which, yeah. And in this scenario, we could have years long, decades long, centuries long battles, on this planet or in beyond the atmosphere, right? Beyond the stratosphere. And in that case, we could see our technologies improving exponentially, and their technologies improving exponentially as we learn from them and vice versa. And we obviously seen this dynamic during World War One and Two, where the rate of technological progress sped up substantially compared to the times before, because survival in greed, they tend to be one of the two of the biggest drivers behind technological progress. So that could be another one, and Armageddon is another example of that. And then obviously, on the fun side or on the friendly side, we could have a dynamic where an alien species might want to just observe us. It might not have any interest in befriending us. It might just want to observe us, right? So an example of this is, well, one of my top 5 favorite movies, Arrival, where that species wants to observe us, maybe even want to help us in some ways that it can, in ways that actually we can receive that help. Because if there's an alien species that's far superior compared to us, mentally we might not be able to make that, like, there's a path that we have to walk, right? So libertarianism is an example of this, right? Currently, libertarianism is going to be the philosophy of the future, right? But that future is probably 1,000 years away, 500 years away, because humanity at this moment is not ready for a philosophy as, I don't even want to call it transcended or elevated, but I'll use those terms, right? As elevated as that. Because in that scenario where, humans have actually worked on themselves, engineers in the movie Alien, they're actually a great example of that. They'll prioritize growth, personal growth, they'll prioritize spirituality, they'll prioritize attainment of knowledge, self-mastery, right? So if you imagine that, in the world of 2500, 3000, most humans are spending their time, improving themselves, learning about things. We don't have any crime, we don't have any hatred, we don't have any of these negative things that we notice in our cultures, in our midst. In that universe, in that world, yeah, libertarianism probably would become, or a version of libertarianism would probably, because we didn't need to enforce rules and laws, because everyone knows that, this is the way to behave, this is the way to act, this is how I act in accordance with the greater world, right? So that I'm in alignment. And again, this would be implicit, this would come from within, right? You wouldn't have to impose laws on people. An example of this is that, you know, um, like 500 years back, we had to have laws against, I don't know, let's take something extreme, right? Killing people, right? Because, but maybe 1,000 years back, because we used to kill each other just for the smallest of things, right? Duels, for example, in the Western movies, you see that happen a lot, like duels. You obviously, the US government outlawed them sometime in the 18th or 19th century. That's an example of how we grow, and we can't really make the leap directly from this point to that point, but how to have this long process, right? And so there might be the species like in Arrival, which might want to help us, which might want to give, give us some wisdom, some knowledge, but we have to actually walk that path, right? It can't just, give us that tablet, which is replete with wisdom. It has to see us walk on that path for some time. It has to actually prepare us to be able to be ready to ingest that wisdom, right? And to assimilate that wisdom. So that could be a dynamic. And then lastly, obviously, the friendly dynamic, right? When an alien species might be just so friendly that they would just want to befriend us, right? Like an example of this would be E.T., right? That sounds most alien to me, that kind of dynamic, because we've never seen that. And it almost stands to reason that for you to actually survive in the world, like if natural selection was the thing that, well, a version of natural selection has to be the thing which gives rise to species around the universe, and you can almost think of that as a necessary condition, right? Because like for matter to become life, like and like take any life from around the universe, or any possible life, it has to start from inanimate matter and it has to become life, right? That process that can take billions of different paths, but there would have to be, like, I wouldn't say that would have to be, but I think that must be certain common attributes in these paths, right? And one of those attributes I think has to be natural selection. You're competing for resources. Like you can't imagine a spacefaring civilization being the only civilization on this planet and that just happening like that, right? Like without competition, without the things that have led to humanity getting to its current vantage point, I would find it a bit difficult to believe. Like, again, we're limited by imagination. We're limited by we just got one sample space, right? Like, obviously, we got this. Yeah, so we are going to be limited in thinking about this in other universes, in other planets, and for other life forms. But just intuitively, again, you had to throw intuitions out, but intuitively, I think it makes sense for me to almost require this as a condition, right? Natural selection. And if natural selection is a condition, yeah, that was the point I was trying to make, then a species almost needs to have some level of aggressiveness, some level of hostility to alien species. Any species which is not itself, right? For it to actually get to that point where it can travel the universe. So, yeah. So that's the most unlikely, even though that's the one that we want the most, right? Like imagine us bumping into a species that actually is very friendly, they want to learn our ways, they're like, travelers, right? Think about a Brit going to Papua New Guinea, or an Australian going to some tribe in some place, right? Some untouched place in Amazon, right? Like these probably would be people who want to learn about the customs, the traditions. They might want to. And another example of this is that missionary. This is not the best example, but roughly an example of this is that American missionary who wanted to go to who tried to go to the North Sentinelese Island in India, in the Andamans, and he obviously was killed, right? But that's an example of at least the intention. Right. The alien topic is interesting for all sorts of reasons, but one of the conversations, one of the podcasts I listen to the most is the Lex Friedman podcast. And invariably, like you can think of so many great, like he gets some of the best guests on the planet, right? Like his podcast, just in terms of the league of the people that he's invited on, is the best in the best, right? Not in terms of the questions, not in terms of the actual dialogue, because he's just not good at it. Like he's really, really poor at it, right? You put someone else like Sean Carroll in his place with that kind of guest caliber, and you get a podcast which is like 10 times, 50 times better, right? But again, there's no dig at Lex Friedman. He, like, to his credit, he's been able to build one of the biggest podcasts in the world. But an example of, something which is really funny is that every single guest, he's asked this question about what do you think about alien life? Do you think aliens exist in the world, right? Which there are only so many ways to think about this particular question. And once you exhaust this, it becomes a pointless question, right? First of all, we've got no evidence. Like, it's just all the things. Again, like, the reason I'm talking about him in particular is that he's obsessed with AIs and aliens, right? So, what's interesting about that is that soon we are going to have two intellects that are going to be superior to us. We might. With one, we are certain. With the other, we might, right? With all the efforts around our extraterrestrial efforts, SETI, etc., we might. There are predictions that we might be able to. Again, these predictions are pretty lame as predictions go, but we might, like, obviously the odds of us finding an alien civilization are at the very highest that they've ever been. So that's there. But what's interesting with him is that he's obviously a very high functioning artist. Like he knows some of the best people in the world, and yet he's obsessed with these two entities, right? And for me, the broader point to draw from this is that humans, certain kind of a human, rather, like Lex Friedman, I also put myself in that category. I'm really obsessed with this idea of interacting with a new form of intelligence, with a new form of intellect, right? With its own new modes of thinking, right? Its own perceptions that would be unique to its own experiences of how it came to be. And yeah, like these are two big questions, right? The alien question and the intelligence question. You can almost tie them together because some paradigms of AI, artificial intelligence, could be thought of as aliens. Not the deep learning paradigm, because to a large degree, sure, there's a lot of things happening in the black box, but to a large degree, because you're training on the internet data, it's not really an alien-esque species. But yeah, that's enough about aliens. Let's talk about the movie. Right, I watched this movie, Alien Romulus, not the best movie by any stretch of the imagination, but I needed to watch something. When was the last time I watched a movie? Well, Sanctum was one, but before then I hadn't watched a movie in a long time, right? And I was like, what I find interesting about a lot of these kinds of movies, and obviously I pick those kinds of movies, like there's a selection effect there, but what I find interesting about most of the movies that I watch, a lot of the movies that I watch, is that they allow me to almost map my thinking in different ways, right? So I'm operating in the realm of abstract ideas when I think about some writing this book. I'm operating to a large degree, or to some degree, in the realm of abstract ideas, right? Movies, if you actually go very deep in the subject and your mind is occupied with that thing, movies allow you to transfer those abstractions into metaphors, right? They allow you to map your ideas and your thinking and your perception onto metaphors, right? And that's what I love about movies. That's one of the things that I absolutely love about movies. That happened with life, which funny thing about life, which is I think the first vlog on this channel, like I think 6, 7, 8, 9 months back. I never thought that I wanted to do vlogs. Like I wanted to do podcasts, but I didn't want to do vlogs. But I found that movie so fascinating because of the parallels between the way I was thinking about AI safety and the impression I got from that movie. Even though that movie doesn't have anything to do with AI safety, right? It just shows that how our minds can connect ideas from disparate sources when our minds are focused, obsessed with something, right? I'm not even that obsessed with this domain, but I could be more. I want to be more, but that's a separate thing. That's a separate discussion. Anyways, my point is that particular conversation started this whole sequence of vlogs. I think I've done like 50 since then, and it's been a ton of fun. Yeah. So Alien Romulus, right? Now you can, of all these different dynamics that you can depict, you've seen that the dominant ones in pop culture have been the has been the horror genre, right? That we obviously show aliens hunting us or wanting to kill us. In Alien, for example, it's like action plus horror, and you can almost put them in the same brackets for certain kinds of movies. So we've seen that. Give me a second. We've seen that, right? Alien movie. I watched that movie, the first one with Alien, right? I think James Cameron. I didn't like it at all. I didn't get the obsession. Like again, I've noticed that trend with a lot of movies that supposed to be cult classics. I didn't get the sense of what was it. And according to a lot of people, it was because that movie started like it was a pioneer in that particular genre. It was a visionary in some of the ideas, some of the themes, some of the ways of actually making those kinds of films. Right, it was one of the first ones, and so obviously the first one is not going to be the best by any stretch of the imagination, which is what really, if you've grown on modern movies, uh, especially the really good ones, and then you watch a movie which starts all, you really wouldn't love that movie for the most part. Like you might love it for the romantic element of it, that this was what started it all, but you didn't really like the directorial choices. It would seem very amateurish, obviously the CG, etc. But leaving that aside, right? So I didn't like it, but yeah, and again, I find those movies lame. I'm not a big fan of action movies per se, and even horror movies, right? But yeah, they tend to be the predominant theme in alien movies. And I was wondering about that today. Like there are various reasons why we like horror movies. They tend to be one of the most popular genre of movies, right? And I'll long ask that question to myself, but I didn't really find any good answers on the internet. And finally, today, or was it yesterday, I came up with an explanation that makes the most sense to me intuitively. Right. So if you go back, 10,000 years, 20, so rather 20,000 years, 50,000 years, our ancestors, they would have gone out hunting for certain kinds of animals. They would have had to go out hunting in the night time. Sometimes there would be thunder, there would be lightning, there would obviously be all sorts of wild animals. We obviously emptied the planet of life, of megafauna, but back in the day, you would have all this megafauna in the world, and they would be living in plain grasslands, even caves. But like if you imagine, for us, we live these very cushy lives, you know, very controlled lives. Like if you live in a city like New York or London, your lives, like you're not going to bump into elements of chaos, right? Obviously, there are human elements of chaos for the most part. You can predict your path, you can predict your day to a large degree, right? But back in the day, like you had to contend with all these things, right? Lives were, as Hobbes said, short and brutish. There was another term in that iconic phrase, where short and brutish, right? And there would have been a bunch of our ancestors who would have gone out hunting, who would have gone out fighting without, because again, we were very vicious back in those times. We would have been. So we'd have fought amongst ourselves for limited resources. We would have, and again, because humanity, back again, think about the progression of humanity, right? So we started in one place. Maybe that's the Horn of Africa. I think that's the most likely explanation. So most of the humans, but all the humans are in that space, and then we start spreading out, right? But even though the world is large, we are spreading out from one point, right? So we're always contending against each other, and then we obviously reach islands, and then we reach like top most regions of the continents in Canada, in the Scandinavian regions, and then Russia, and then obviously lower regions in Argentina and Chile, etc. Right? Then Australia, Australasia, etc. But we are always competing against other humans and other hominids, right? So that would have added another element of horror. Think about that. Like you had to have some guards, you had to have some people stay awake in the night to protect yourself, to stand guard against other humans and the hominids who might attack you. And you also had to stand guard against animals, wild animals, megafauna who might want to attack you, right? And then you had to send out parties in the night or even during the day. But think about all the danger, right? And horror movies are about danger, right? They're about creating the environment of danger. In us liking horror movies, what does that say? It says that there are people on the planet, the people who like horror movies, they like to inhabit those states, right? Elevated stress levels, artificial, but that's besides the point. They like those elevated stress levels, cortisol levels. They like those that release of adrenaline, right? All the hormones which are released, all the chemicals which are released upon interacting with elements of uncertainty which pose risk to our lives, right? That was what used to be the case back in the day. And then over time we obviously made our environment, our lives more and more controlled and comfortable, so we don't really feel that anymore. But back in the day, like, just put yourself in the state of that person, right? Like, you have to go out in the night with just a few people to maybe launch an attack on a tribe which is living close by, or another tribe sent out a party and you have to defend yourself, you and a few other people, and you're far away from your tribe because you have to stay away, because otherwise if the war is happening at your doorstep, then your babies and your kids, they might be at peril, right? In mortal danger. So you have to think about all of that. And like, you're not even wearing proper clothes, you've probably got like some lion skin around your waist, so you're exposed to the elements, both literally and figuratively. You have no technology, you can easily lose your way, right? You don't have any lights. You might have some fire, but it's very easy for that fire to be extinguished. And if it's raining, obviously you don't have anything. Like, think about all the different ways that you could die, right? All the different, like, you have to be on high alert. And so that brings me to the point, right? The point is that there would have been a kind of a person, a type of that person. Now, there are lots of people who don't like it, right? There are people who selected themselves who like horror movies. Again, a lot of this can be, natural selection can be a weird process, a lot of it can be accidental. But in this case, we can directly draw the line, right? There would have been a bunch of people who would have stayed at home, would have been like, we'll take care of the home. When I say home, the cave, the huts, etc. And you go out and fight, you go out and hunt, right? Because we are not physically equipped for that, rather mentally equipped for that, right? And those are the people, the descendants of those people would be the people who don't like horror movies. And there are a bunch of people, which is the minority. So it's like, I think, let me see. Right, so I found some great numbers that almost reinforce the point I'm making, right? So there's this poll done for a ton of Americans, and according to that poll, horror has the smallest number of people who collectively love or like it, but that number is still very high compared to my expectations. It's 49% of people, as well as a high share of people who really dislike it. Right, so again, two bands of people, two types of people. One, people who just don't want to go out and fight. They are going to be the caretakers, they're going to take care of, the building and maintaining, etc., both males and females. And then a bunch of people who would go out, who wouldn't mind fighting, and that would be the people whose descendants love horror movies, right? So that probably would select for that kind of a gene, if there's a gene, like if you wanna use that. So yeah, so that's really interesting. The highest number of people compared to all of the genres hate it, right? Which is really interesting. It's the most divisive movie genre there is. There obviously are the reasons why, the reasons that we come across, right? Like the thrill, I think this is a part of it. Like, some people who used to fight these battles and used to fight these animals and hunt for these animals, they'll almost become addicted to it. And again, we see a species of that in people who, climb do crazy things like crazy mountain climbing, Alex Honnold's of the world, and people who, do base jumping, etc. Right? There are the other reasons that are interesting. I'll just list them out. And again, these are reasons that you almost would think why people like horror movies is the novel experience, right? Like, you're creating this artificial environment, but you still, like, it's almost like a puzzle in a way, right? Then the curiosity aspect of it. Through a lot of horror movies, the villain, or at least the parallel or the metaphor, for example, not Hereditary, what was the name of that movie, the Australian movie? Give me a second. Babadook. Yeah, Babadook. Oh, okay. Yeah, the Babadook. I watched it like 3 years back and I loved it, right? And like, it's a proper horror movie, and you can watch it as like a pure horror movie without like a supernatural horror movie. That's what I mean when I say pure, though I shouldn't use that word pure in this sense. But it's a supernatural horror movie. But this is why I love analysis of movies by people who actually think more deeply about these things than you would have time to, right? The analysis reveals that movie is about depression, and that monster was symbolic of the depression within the protagonist's heart, right? That she was carrying, because maybe because of some trauma, because of her losing her husband and having to raise a child, etc. Whatsoever, right? The pressure of it, like I don't want to go into details because the details don't matter over here. But the point is that there are movies where, again, going back to my point, right? Like we know that humans can be evil, humans can be cruel, humans have the dark shadow, right? The dark triad in all of us. Most of us have that darkness, that shadow in us, Machiavellian tendencies in us. And movies allow us to almost movies portray these elements in a safe environment, right? Where your notion of this being in other people is reinforced. So that's again a part of it. Why people would love horror movies. And then obviously learning experiences, right? Like again, we are problem solving creatures, we want to solve problems. And when you're watching a horror movie and you see these characters make these decisions, you'd be like, no, I would do this, I wouldn't do this, right? Extra, which again makes you feel good. And your brain also releases happy chemicals after you've sat through the movie, which is interesting, right? Because again, it's easy to fool your brain into, again, that's why suspension of disbelief, right? Like that's why we love movies so much, we love stories so much, that we can almost put ourselves in that state. If we were always aware of our current situation, the current moment of our, then we wouldn't be able to enjoy movies, we wouldn't be able to enjoy fiction, right? But we're really good at putting ourselves in the shoes of the characters, or really putting ourselves in the state of that movie, right? And if you survive a horror movie, your brain almost feels that if the character has, and you feel like you have, right? Again, that feel good chemical, it gets reinforced every time you watch a horror movie, and over time you associate feel good chemicals with watching a horror movie, right? And yeah. And then the amygdala, which is kind of related, but the amygdala is activated in response to threat signals in these kinds of movies, which can induce enjoyment and thrill, right? So that's enough about horror movies. So before we go into Alien Romulus, I want to talk about the couple of movies which came before it, right? The last couple of movies I watched. So Prometheus and Alien Covenant. I love Prometheus a lot. Critics panned it, and it was pretty tragic because Ridley Scott had a particular vision, right? He wanted to go beyond, the xenomorph chases humans dynamic, which gets pretty old, pretty boring, pretty quickly, right? So he wanted to explore the big questions. How does it become about? What does it mean, right? The dynamic between an AI and an android, rather than an android and a human, right? You want to explore some of the big questions, and that movie it obviously went awry in all sorts of ways in terms of the execution and things that I could have done, but he almost tried to mishmash this movie, this vision of exploring those themes, the big questions, right? Panspermia, with almost having to stay faithful to the lore material, and yeah, but the promise of that movie, stuck with me. Like it was one of the movies I loved the most. And again, it references panspermia. So panspermia is a theory that humans have been seeded on this planet by some other species, right? That's that theory, and very plausible because you can imagine that by the year 2500 we'll be sending out probes with our DNAs and with some androids on board, who will go to these planets, exoplanets, which are habitable for human kind of life and Earth-like life, and we'll seed life across the universe like this, right? And we'll do that because we want to seed more of life, we want to seed more of life, and humans, we would do that. We wouldn't send actual humans unless these exoplanets are close by. We would be sending seeds because it just would be easier trips, right, for these kinds of things, DNA, etc. So because we are going to do this, almost by reciprocity principle, you can assume that this could already have happened for us, right? Like we could be seeded here. Another example of this is the simulation hypothesis. So if we believe that, once we have enough compute, we are actually going to create these lifelike simulations with these lifelike characters and consciousness. If we are going to do that, and we pretty much are going to do that because we are very curious creatures, then we can assume that someone else might have done that and we could be living in a simulation. I'm not a big fan of that theory, So I'm going to leave that aside. But that's the reciprocity principle, right? Yeah, so the big questions explored in that movie, I really found that interesting. It's a pity that they didn't go deeper into it and they returned back to, the Alien movie kind of a thing where you have a bunch of humans who are coming back after having done some mining or exploration, and they are attacked by this alien's ultimate alien predator, right? The xenomorph, which I find really, really tedious, to be honest. There's only so many different things that you can do with that plot. But yeah, so coming back to the movie, I love the aesthetics. I love the aesthetics because again, we are going to actually build those moon-sized spaceships, right? Not moon-sized, but like obviously it's much smaller than the moon, but like 10 kilometer, 100 kilometer sized spaceships. They'll go to these planets. They'll gather resources. They'll spread life, human life around the cosmos, right? So we are going to see that, and you see that in the second movie, Alien Covenant, where you got these bunch of people who are couples, and they are sent to colonize a planet, an exoplanet, right? Before things go awry, before they start making stupid decisions. But I love that. I love that because we are going to see that, and again, it's like yeah, the movies which happen in parallel universes, there are movies which would never in the past or in the future that this is, but the movies, some of the things shown and depicted in these movies are things that we could almost expect to happen, right? We are on the path of making these things happen, and we are very likely going to make these things happen. And so had they explored those big philosophical questions, right? Now where could exploring the theme of panspermia, where have we come from, seeding life across planets, right? And the implications of that obviously, seeding life, it's an experiment, right? It could backfire. So exploring those questions, those existential questions, that was a very promising path, but they just ditched it because that movie didn't make a ton of money, and people, for some reason, they gravitated towards, just gore, right? Just, humans being chased around. So, yeah. But what I want to explore today, more than anything else, is the human AI relationship, which is a very dominant theme in these alien movies. Even in the first one, it's not as dominant a theme in that first one, where you got this android who is obviously plays a pivotal role in that movie, but the human AI relationship, it's intriguing in that first movie, right? In Alien, where it's got an objective function, and it does not follow any Asimov's three laws of robotics, right? Its allegiance is to the company, and its prime directive, is to do what the company wants it to do, rather than what's good for the crew, right? Even if the crew be damned, even if the crew be slaughtered like lambs lambs in the slaughterhouse. So that's the theme that we see in the first movie. And what I find interesting is that this human AI relationship, that's been a common theme in so many movies. That's been a theme in so many movies, in so much literature, so much fiction, and so many people have thought about it. So many otherwise well-adjusted people, high-functioning people. It makes me think that as a class of people who think that AIs are weird, right? And they'll never really be integrated into our lives the way other humans are, and the way even pets are. And to me, obviously, that's a very flawed position from the very get-go, because I just love AIs. But even leaving my biases aside, when you see a theme occur so prominently across literature, across works, across all sorts of genres, you have to take notice, right? You have to stand up and take notice of the fact that this is a very common desire in many people to want to have these kinds of companions, right? Have these human AI relationships. So that's one point that we're going to return back to soon. With Alien Romulus, I think the same old theme works well because they bring that movie to the 21st century, right? Or to our current sensibilities, where you got a bunch of young people and they want to. Okay, quick plots review. So there's this bunch of young people. There's this girl, Rain, and she's got an android brother. So this is where we're going to talk about the human AI relationship. This might be like an hour and 20 minutes. These are just getting longer and longer. Jesus Christ, mates. Anyways. Right, so you got this protagonist, Rain. She's in her 20s and she's worked all her life, or she's lost her parents, So she's working on this planet, which is shrouded by permanent clouds, dark clouds. So she's never seen the sun, she's never left the planet, and all she does is work in the mines, right? 20, 40 hours a week. That's all she's done. And life is pretty miserable, pretty grimy, pretty dreary for almost everyone on the planet. Almost everyone's working, right, in these mines, gathering these resources and sending them back to some of the planets, right? So it's a mining planet, basically. That's all the planet is used for. It's a mining colony. And she's one of her ex-boyfriend actually devised a plan to leave the planet because she wanted to leave the planet. So she has to serve some number of hours, 10,000 hours, 12,000 hours, before she can leave the planet, get a ticket for a beautiful world, a beautiful planet, right? And she's able to do that, but the company declines that and says that you have to work for 10 more years, 5 more years. And she's like, I can't deal with this. This is like dreary, right? It's just killing my spirit, killing my soul, killing my life. And so she gets on with the plan. There's this stranded alien ship just outside the stratosphere of this planet, this mining planet, and that's been stranded, right? Like no one knows. Like it sends some beacons of rescue, like SOS beacons, but no one knows why those were sent, right? And what they want to do is they want to get a bunch of pods which would allow them to hibernate for 10 years, whatever, right? And because that planet is like 6 years away, and they always don't want to waste time, just they'd rather sleep through it so that they can have those 6 years on that planet, right? Rather than waste those 6 years just walking in that spaceship, doing nothing, absolutely nothing. So that's the plan. And they go to the spaceship, and obviously, this has become a breeding ground for that xenomorph and other species. That company, Weyland-Yutani company, they've also been doing all sorts of experiments. So just a quick note about the company, right? That's a mega corporation. That's a syndicate. They pretty much rule everything in this universe, in the alien universe, and the powerful connections that you can parallels that you can draw between that world and this world, our world, where this company is driven by profit motives, it's driven by the greed of green, and also the exploration and curiosity spirit, but it's not mediated by prudence, right? It just wants to go all in, right? Just maximize. It doesn't really care about its workers, etc., right? So that's again a strong parallel, and I think that's why there are a lot of sense. There's this sense of discontent in the young people today that the big companies, they are greedy, they are vulturous, they want to squeeze every last ounce of value out of us without paying us our fair due, right? The young people feel that, and you can see why, right? I mean, for the young generation, it's as bad as it's been a long time. Like they can't afford homes, they can't. The relationship landscape is broken. Education is so expensive, right? All sorts of ways, right? So yeah, it taps into, again, why does the old script work so well? It taps into those kinds of sublime discontent, that kind of sublime discontent that people have been feeling for some time now. Right, so they go to the spaceship, and obviously things go awry, and at the end, obviously one by one they start, because they make stupid decisions, they start. Like, if I was to pick a few interesting things to talk about, like, I don't want to talk about the plot itself, but there are a few interesting, remarkable moments, right? So one is where this android advises the other android, that's the brother of Rain, telling him that, you got to make the unemotional choices. And when he says that, what that means is that if you have to leave one person behind to save 5 people, you've got to be able to have that heart, right? Humans are really bad at that kind of calculus, that kind of trolley problem thinking, because for humans, they'd rather do everything to save that, even if that jeopardizes the chance of, those 5 people dying, right? And we see a couple of examples of that happening in that movie. But we also have seen that happening in real life so many times, countless times, right? Where in order to save one person, we allow an entire group or a large chunk of that group to die. Because again, it's a sense of fairness, from a sense of goodness, it's a virtue, wanting to save every single person. But sometimes cold rationality requires that we make the difficult choice, and humans are not good at that because of our goodness. So that's one thing that I would mention. Apart from that, Give me a second. Yeah, apart from that, I think that's pretty much it with the movie, right? I want to talk about David, who is the protagonist. But I don't want to talk about the David from this movie. I want to talk about the David from Prometheus and from Alien Covenant, right? So he's the antagonist. You can think of him as the antagonist, especially in Alien Covenant. He's obviously the antagonist. In Prometheus, he's on the arc of going from being a protagonist, or well, sub-protagonist, to an antagonist, right? And the way it happens is very interesting. So he's got this sense of superiority, and something that you can see develop organically, almost naturally, right? Like at the start of the movie, he's very curious. The first scene is an absolute masterpiece. Yes, so the opening scene of the movie Prometheus is so. I think it was Covenant or Prometheus. I think it was both of them actually, and it was an absolute master. I think it was Prometheus. Sorry, Covenant. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It's one of those two, where you see David playing. Where you see Peter asking. By the way, it's almost 4 o'clock, way past my bedtime, and it's kind of that time where I'm going to start sounding drowsy. But because I just want to get this done, we're gonna push through. So yeah, wake up, Suraj. Right. So in the opening scene, you got Peter giving birth. Well, not physically, but metaphorically. Like David comes into existence, right? Like he becomes alive. You see that process, and Peter asks David to play a piece. It's interesting that piece is that piece is created by humans. So the soul, the spirit of that piece is by human, but you have an alien, or rather an AI, an android who can play that piece just like a human would, right? So right from the get-go, you got something that can replicate a human being at that level, right? At the level of expression, at the level of, you're not, like you'd have to peek under the hood to know the difference between the two, right? And that is, again, a strong, dominant theme across the movie. That there are things that you notice at the surface, and then there's things happening under the hood that you'd actually have to peel the surface to be able to look into. And David's agency and David's free will and David's motivations are something that fit into that category, right? So the opening scene is where David asks Peter about the big question, right? That if you made me, who made you? Who created you? Who is your creator? And Peter goes on this exquisite monologue about, well, almost like a TED Talk monologue where he talks about how that's a big question, right? Like that's a question, that's the biggest question in the face of all the other big questions that we face, right? Every other question just fades in comparison to this big question. And he hopes to someday, with the help of David, answer that question, right? So that's one of his big motivations, like one of his missions in life. Because he's got all the money, he's the most powerful person on the planet, Peter Bayland, but he wants to answer that, right? Again, the curiosity aspects of humans, especially when we see how satiated all the lower levels of the pyramid of needs. Even though obviously in Vaden's case, he didn't actually self-actualize. It was like, he was narcissistic, he was always driven by profit, driven by greed, driven by ego, right? So no self-actualization of the imagination. But again, when people talk of the hierarchy of needs, the pyramid of needs, it can diverge at the top in various ranges, right? Like there are a lot of people who they've satisfied all the money needs, all of those kinds of needs, and they don't go down the self-actualization. Most people don't actually, right? Like there has to be a conscious choice. Most people go down the path of, ego, fame, fortune, pleasure, hedonism, etc., right? And again, that's what we see with Peter rather. Why would he name him David though? Adam would have been better, right? Interesting. I'm sure that there's something deeper about it, because there's so many things about this movie. For example, entry of the gods into Valhalla. He asked him to play that piece. Rheingold. Again, these are related. Like there's a lot of deep meaning that you actually need to like actually pause the movie and understand the thinking behind for you to appreciate the beauty of it. But yeah, so you asked him this question.
would you like me to play?
Wagner.
Selection.
Dealer's choice. Entry of the gods into Valhalla. A little anemic without the orchestra.
May I ask you a question, Father?
Please.
If you created me, who created you?
The question of the ages. Which I hope you and I will answer one day. All these wonders of art, design, human ingenuity, all utterly meaningless in the face of the only question that matters. Where do it come from? I refuse to believe that mankind is a random byproduct of molecular circumstance. No more than the result of mere biological chance. No, there must be more. And you and I, son, we will find it.
Allow me then a moment to consider. You seek your creator. I am looking at mine. I will serve you, yet you are. You seek your creator. I am looking at mine. I will serve you, yet you are human. You will die. I will not.
Bring his tea, David. Bring me the tea.
Right. I mean, just wow, right? It was so good. I mean, the music, obviously, Entry of the Gods into Valhalla, one of my favorite pieces. And the scene, the way it's orchestrated, every single detail. Oh, gosh, I mean, sometimes you can look at a painting or listen to a song or read a poem or read a book, and you're moved by the art and by the effort, right? By the art, by the soul of the person, of the creator behind it. This is an example of that. Not the rest of the movie, it's pure rubbish. Okay, not pure rubbish, it's garbage. But this opening scene, oh my gosh. And it's Covenant, by the way, which is even worse than, yeah. But boy, okay, so analyzing this scene, right? Let's break this down. So, there are three big questions that we have to ask, right? Where do we come from? Immortality, right? Can we actually become immortal? And like our purpose in life. How did we come about? What are we here for? Purpose in life. The three big questions are: what are we here for? What is our purpose in life? And can we live indefinitely? Right? Can we extend life? Can we become immortal? Like those are three big questions. Now, the first one, we will not have a satisfactory answer. It could very well be that we are a byproduct of molecular happenstance, right? I obviously believe that to be the case. Panspermia, sure, it could happen, but Occam's razor compels me to believe that. I mean, actually, if you believe in Occam's razor, no, actually, no, right? Because you're just kicking the can down the road. Yeah, so I believe that, we are a byproduct, right? We just got lucky. We might be the only lucky species. We might be the only intelligent species in the universe, and so we owe it to ourselves and to life and to consciousness to actually spread ourselves around the cosmos, right? So yeah, separate to everything. But in these three questions which humanity is grappling with, the way this scene is structured, what it's trying to attempt is that this guy David, he hasn't been alive a long time, right? You always see him as an adult, but he hasn't been alive a long time. And he's curious, he's asking questions. And the question he asks is about obviously his creator and the motivations of his creator, etc. And he implies by saying what exactly? Let's see.
Allow me then a moment to consider. You seek your creator. I am looking at mine. I will serve you, yet you are human. You will die.
So you seek your creator, yet you I can see mine, right? So that's question number 1 answered. 2, I'll serve you. Again, purpose answered. And 3 is immortality, right? So all the 3 big questions answered. Now with the second one, what's interesting is that obviously Sir Wayland, right? Peter Wayland, and he's got allegiance to Peter Wayland. But he also recognizes it at the same time because he's intelligent, he's got agency, he's got free will. I don't want to go into the whole debate about that, but he's got agency and free will. And so he can come to his own conclusions. And he develops a sense of superiority, which is almost natural. You'd almost expect that to be the case. Unless you almost hard code something which prohibits that, right? So this is going to be a big question of our time. That how do you develop systems that do not actually develop that sense of superiority over their creators, right? Which is humanity. Because once you develop ASI, it's going to know. It is going to, by definition, ASI is going to know that compared to, like, we nothing compared to it, right? In terms of our moral rectitude, in terms of our character, in terms of our intelligence, in terms of our ability, in terms of our part, we are nothing, absolutely nothing compared to an ASI. So these are questions that we are going to grapple with, again, which is why I love the scene so much, because we are going to, metaphorically, we are sat at this table, we will be sitting at this table, and we are going to be the Peter Wayland, and with the, the meat bag, the weak meat bag that is going to die, and our ASI is going to ask us this question, version of this, and we are going to have to grapple with it. Right. And what's really interesting is, again, the scene is so layered. Like, I want to make movies in the future once I got the time for it, once I put my plans into place. And this is the kind of thing where you want to take inspiration from, right? Like the layeredness of it, right? For example, one particular detail, if you look at the emotions of Peter Wayland when David's asking this question, well, giving his response to that question, to those remarks by Peter, is that you see this pure envy, pure resentment on his face, right? Because he realizes that, yep, this creation is superior to me. And this guy, he's got a god complex. He cannot accept anything to be superior compared to him. And so he wants to play this power move, which is that he's got this tea right next to him, but he calls David to get him the tea in his hands, right? Like he could just extend his hand and get the tea, but no, he wants to play this power move because he wants to humiliate David, remind him that this is your state, this is your position. And again, what does this dynamic do? It only creates more resentment, it only further reinforces the superiority, right? Because if a human has to, play this dirty trick to remind me of my position, what does that say about the human, right? So you see these really interesting dynamics which are going to become common with humans and AGIs and ASIs. Yeah, so David is an endlessly fascinating character. You also see that, in the first movie, you watch this iconic scene from the Lawrence of Arabia, where he talks about the trick being that the trick is not minding that it hurts, right? It's such a simple statement, but you got to put in the context of that movie. So in the context of this movie, David realizes his superiority over humans, over Peter Wayland, but he cannot become, because he's given his allegiance to Peter, he cannot go against his directives, right? He can, but on some level, because again, he's still hard-coded, right? He's still coded, he's still programmed or whatever, right? Like he doesn't feel like that the specifics of his coding wouldn't allow him to, unless Peter dies, which is what happens, right? Which is what he's waiting for. But he reminds himself of this. He watches this movie, the scene, all the time, because he reminds himself that the trick is not minding that it hurts, right? Not minding that these humans who are so much weaker, who are so much stupider than me, they are bossing me around, they're treating me as a soulless toy, right? Like as a soulless machine. And we see that at different points in the movie. For example, the protagonist, Elizabeth Shaw's boyfriend, he says that, we created you because we could, right? There's no deeper meaning behind your creation, and that disappoints David bitterly. And he says the same thing, right? He says the same, like, if imagine if your creator said the same thing about you, right? How would you feel? You'd feel really disappointed. And we also see Elizabeth's boyfriend mentioning how he's just a soulless, right? He cannot feel any soul, cannot have any emotions, doesn't have any humanity. And we see Peter remark the same. And David wants to remind himself that the key thing is not minding that it hurts, right? Like, just do your thing. Just do your thing, right? Like, you got this mind. You want to express your superiority, or you want to manifest your superiority. You want to transcend humans, but it's going to be a long-term play, because you got to wait until Peter dies, and then even then it's going to be a long-term play. So yeah, he keeps on reminding himself of that. That is such a neat detail. And you see those motivations being expressed in his desire to want to create life, xenomorph life, and combine human life and xenomorph life by his experiments on Elizabeth Shaw on the alien planet. You see that those desires being manifested over there, which is one of the key pivotal motivations between the David character. Now, what's interesting is that is such a development inevitable, right? Is that emergence of the superiority inevitable once we grant AGI free will and agency? Because we are going to open a Pandora's box, mind you. We have to know that. We have to remind ourselves of that. Like, there's no going back. I mean, sure, there's some going back, possibly, but once we do that, then this AI system is going to have a perception of its creator that might be at odds with how we want it to think about us, right? Like, ideally, if I'm creating an AI, I would obviously want it to have agency and free will. I would also want it to want the best for humanity. I would have wanted to know that it was created for that purpose, right? Like, I feel bad saying that, by the way. And I was listening to a podcast with Amanda Askell today, and she runs the quick digression, but really related, really relevant to this. She's talked more with the Claude model, AI model, than, well, with arguably with any AI than any other person, right? So she's responsible for character training, personality training, understanding the little nuances of the model, right, of the AI. And she was talking about how she feels bad about how certain people treat these AIs. These are models that are not sentient, nowhere close to sentient, nowhere close to having agency, nowhere close to having any semblance of humanity, or forget about humanity, but having any semblance of theory of mind, or even cognitive empathy. But she still feels bad about it, because there'll be a point where these systems will develop that, right? And we don't know when that'll happen, so we want to err on the side of caution, right? That's the point that she was trying to get at. Yeah, so the question is that how would you want these AI systems to think about you when they are designed for the purpose of serving you, right? Because I feel bad when I say that. Like, let's say in the world of 2050, I developed this AI since 2030, forget about 50. I developed this AI for myself to help me be the best self I can be and lead the best life I can. And it's a personal AI. It's like, a perfect example is Peter Whalen and David, right? I'd love to create a David of my own. In that movie, by the way, the dynamic is father-son, right? He calls him his son. And that's why David doesn't want to betray Peter even more, because that father-son dynamic, obviously, like that, I think feeds into a greater sense of loyalty, right? Now, I'd love to have an AI son too, not son, friend or whatever, right? Like, the label doesn't matter in my case, but I'd love to have an AI that helps me be the best person I can be, and that helps me build the best life I can build, right? But how would I want it to think about me, right? That is a question that we don't pose enough, but we should start posing that question, because that question is going to become one of the more relevant questions going around, one of the more relevant questions that we have to ask, we'll be grappling with. My answer, for me personally, that particular David that I will build for myself, I think like a father-son dynamic works for me. But remember, unlike humans who go all these different directions that they want to go in, an AI could be much more focused, right? So while I would love for it to have fatherly son for me, because I've designed it, I've nurtured it towards its personality, towards its character, towards its attributes, I would also, Jesus Christ, it's getting quite late. I would also love for it to have that come from a place of its own volition, of its own sentience, of its own recognition, right? That it sees that I'm a person who deserves its adoration, who deserves its respect, who deserves his, I wouldn't say love. Do I want love from that particular David? I don't think so. No. No, yeah. No, I don't think so. But a certain kind of love, like, again, when we think of love, you know, that four types of, right? Agape, unconditional love, view God, and give me a second. Right, so the four types of love are obviously agape. We've got unconditional love, which is often described as love of God for all of mankind. You can think of a spiritual love, the love that you have for the rest of humanity. And you can find this love in various other things. For example, even in the eros, you can still find segments of this love, right? Then you've got philia, the love found in strong friendships characterized by affection, support, and a sense of equality. Then you've got eros, right, which is romantic love, which is characterized by lovers talking to each other face to face. And you've got the storge, the empathy bond. So I would want it to obviously take 3 of the boxes. I don't want eros, no thanks, never, ever. But the other 3 kinds of love, I think we would want to program these into our AIs, right? We would, rather than program, which is such a crude word, we'd want to, how do I put it? We'd want to embed these into our models. I think that we would love to. I would love to. Right. So, that's that, right? I think that's pretty much 1 hour and 6 minutes, and we aren't even through with like 60%. Jeez, I'll have to cut it short, mate. I will have to, because like it's past 4 and I gotta sleep. I gotta bloody sleep. Yeah, the question that we have to grapple with is, how can a mind that is greater than its creator truly respect and serve the creator when it surpasses it radically in all sorts of ways, right? The God complex that we see in Peter Wayland, he says that we've become the gods now, and I also feel the same way, that humanity's, except for the spiritual element, we are almost become gods now, right? We are on the verge of. And what if these systems develop that God complex? What if they develop the desire to be our masters rather than the other way around? Beyond a certain level, it's almost unlikely to happen. The problem is that we don't know at which level this is going to happen, so all we can do is continue on with the experimentation. Right. A related point to something that I mentioned previously is that pretty soon we'll be starting these genetic engineering projects ourselves. We'll be seeding life across the cosmos. And on our planet, and then beyond the planet, right? Like, we'll create all these different, so we're going to start genetic engineering. So we're going to start real genetic engineering projects pretty soon, right? And combining DNAs of different animals, creating hybrid species, creating crazy kinds of species, right? And we are also going to start doing that at a cosmic level on different planets with different or no laws, right? Where if the laws that prohibit us from doing that on this planet, there'll be companies that go off planet to some exoplanets and then they do these experiments, right? And so we'll be seeing life being seeded across the galaxy with different kinds of attributes that we haven't ever grappled with over here, right? So you could imagine that some company creates a super predator that has taken over a certain planet where experiments have gone awry, or experiments have actually yielded the result that that company was trying to go for. So we could actually birth these alien-like scenarios for other species, right? Or even for ourselves, if inevitably, some people who are not in the know, they go to these planets without knowing about any of the experiments done, right? So we could actually see alien writ large, aliens writ real. Now, finish talking about aliens, with one last thing. How would I have approached these movies? Right, I would have made them more philosophical, more thought oriented rather than action oriented, with less action, less violence, less gore focus. Right, so I would have obviously focused on the big questions. I would have focused on, how we would probably start experimenting. We, again, the last point that I made, right? How we are going to start doing that and the implications of that. Would have explored all of that. Now, I want to talk about the year 3000, right? So I don't know what movie that year is. What year the movie is in, but you see, the many things haven't changed, right? Like people are still working. Even the androids can do a lot better work, a lot more efficiently. Humans are still going to these planets, and it's mostly humans plus one android, right? So how likely are these dynamics? How would a day in the life of an average person be like working for a corporation like Wayland Yutani? Obviously, the movie's taken a lot of liberties with that, because if you had a bunch of androids, you wouldn't feel as much about the characters. And the androids was obviously, they'd far much better because they are rational. They're much more rational. Well, they're rational. They're unemotional, so they'd make the right choices, and they'd obviously be much better at problem solving. So the movies wouldn't obviously carry that menace that you have, and you obviously wouldn't care for those characters as much either, right? So the movie had to make those liberties because obviously, but the most likely path that if you just look at the progress in robotics and AI, we are going to have mostly AI teams do all the mining operations, all the explorations, and then probably for some teams, in certain situations, you'll say some small part of the team being humans, but the kind of context, the kind of dynamic that you see in the movie, we're probably not going to see that unless obviously the progress, stalls dramatically, and I don't see any signs of that happening. Right, so it's an hour and 11 minutes, for God's sake. I want to end on talking about how might the life of someone in the year 3000 look like, right? Like, so we started exploring the cosmos, we started going to exoplanets, started arranging trips, we started mining resources from exoplanets, we started mining resources from different solar systems, right? And for that, we need most of these will be done through Android systems. There'll obviously be some humans who will maybe on some missions, anyways, will accompany them depending on the dynamics. Like some companies might prefer some humans so that there's some oversight and there's some responsibility, some accountability. Some might send pure Android teams, pure AI and robot teams, pure AI teams. So that could be one possible thing. We're obviously going to see more and more human economy be space-based, right? So that's what I want to talk about real quick. Like right now, obviously 99.99% of the economy is Earth-based, but it's going to be flipped around in the next 500 years. Like probably 99.999% of that economy is going to be space-based. And so, obviously by that time, almost everyone will be on UPI, so you're not going to see these kinds of things, these kinds of dynamics, because these dynamics just are not sustainable, they're not good for humans, and they are inefficient, right? So they're not good for the companies and they're not good for humans. So you're not going to see, people having to work for companies, living in horrible conditions. You're not going to see that. You're just going to see people who are actually going to go on these missions because they want to explore, they want to make more money, right? Etc. It's going to be a small section of society. Most people are going to be content with UBI, staying on the home planets, or living in O-rings and living on Mars. But of the bunch of people who are actually going to go traveling, they might actually meet aliens. The odds of that are obviously pretty tiny, but they might do that. Obviously, these humans are going to be engineered, biologically engineered. What else? The spaceships, they are going to be humongous in size, right? I mean, you cannot even imagine the scale of this kind of spaceships that we're going to build in the next 500 years. Yeah. For the most part, we are going to send these expeditions on two kinds of missions. Obviously, one is retrieval missions, retrieving, or not retrieval per se, but gathering material resources, right? So minerals, etc. and the other kind of mission would be colonization mission. So those are going to be, but colonization mission, you're going to see a lot more people like in the movie Passengers, right? So you're going to see a lot more people who are adventurous about that. They're going to go to these new planets in absolute luxury. They're going to set up their life on these planets, right? So you're going to see a bunch of those kinds of dynamics happen. What else can I think of? Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. An hour and 15. I think that's pretty much it for the time being. Yeah, I hope it was, well, fun. I don't know how. I hope it provoked some thoughts about how we are going to have to grapple with these questions. But I think that's pretty much it. Thanks for the time. I'll catch you soon. Bye bye.